Very warm welcome to the 76th edition of Europe Calling, the webinar format which brings European politics closer to people, and this time in cooperation with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And actually the president, the co-president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation is with us, Barbara Unmüßig. With her I have been working together since, so long time. Certainly 20 years, I'm not sure, but something of that magnitude. And it's great that we are co-hosting this. And we have also with us Julia Reda. Julia Reda was unfortunately a good colleague. She refused all dirty offers. A good colleague in the last European Parliament. She was an MEP for the Pirate Party and a specialist for intellectual property rights. And we always shared common views around, for instance, that you should not price things which have a marginal cost of zero, and scarce make things scarce which are actually abundant. And we are also honored to have Tahir Amin here, especially honored. He is based in New York, in the moment in the UK, and therefore a former fellow citizen of us. And we are waiting for you to come back. And he has founded a special organization in order to promote access to knowledge. And he's a lawyer by profession. So we will be curious to learn about his work. And Julia is a member and working as on IP issues with the Society for Civil Rights. I hope I got it right now, the English translation. However, Europe Calling is a space for you. I will not take a lot of time on substance. But the issue is clear. Deadly patents, ? Some of you perhaps now miss the ambassador of India. She had to cancel at short notice, but we have a great panel anyway, and we'll get also a global view on the matter. The issue here is that we of course know we have a global pandemic. And at the same time, we have scarcity of vaccines. And science was able to develop at record speed vaccination. And at the same time, although the idea how to fight the disease is now in the world, we have still some issues with production technology, but generally the knowledge is there. There was an application by several member states at the WTO to basically limit property rights in order to have more abundant production of vaccines. This sounds as a very good idea, and this is why it's important to have also in Europe a space for this discussion. My impression was that in comparison to the global importance of the disease, the fact that Brazil and India asked for a lifting of this patent right was a very small debate in Europe, also when having in mind that India has the largest production capacity when it comes to vaccines. So therefore, it is a very important debate, and it also raises wider questions of the access to knowledge and ideas which can bring humanity further, and whether money should be the limiting factor to using great ideas, and therefore limiting the access to these ideas for those who can't pay. At the same time, of course, we need to finance science and research and development, and perhaps there are more intelligent ways to get this done, in order to set the incentives for researchers, get them compensated, while at the same time having the ideas and methods in public domain. So this is our issue, our debate, and we will start with not without having the rules here set straight. First, you are you're warmly invited to share the best ideas you hear here on Twitter, on Facebook, wherever you are. Please send the respective quotes, and you can use a hashtag deadly patents as a hashtag so that we can see each other also in social media. Furthermore, we are looking forward to your questions. So you can put your questions under F&A or Q&A, and you can rank the questions and the remarks from your fellow participants by a like, and we will try to prioritize those questions which get most attention. And please don't forget, if you raise your hand, if you ask a question and you please. Oh, this is a permanent. Now I'm red. So okay, it should be green, but the camera is always turning red. I don't know why. The problem is, so if you have such questions and if you have affiliations, please make them explicit so that we know who has been asking and whom you may represent. We are honored that we had 1,500 registrations. It shows how big the issue is. And now we are already nearly 800 here. So this is great, and I'm sure more will join us. So now we will first listen to our great panelists. And Barbara, you will intervene then, or will you open now? How do you prefer it?
Jetzt, ja. Ich bin auf jetzt eingestellt.
Gut. Dann,
yes, I prepared myself for now, so we do it now then.
Bitteschön.
Ja, offensichtlich habe ich jetzt das Wort. Ich habe gerade keine Übersetzung.
I think that the floor has just been given to me. I could not hear the final words of Sven, I'm afraid, but I would like to welcome you wholeheartedly also. And I think that this is a topic which very sadly is being overlooked and not discussed quite enough. And that's why I'm very happy that we jointly coordinated and organized this webinar. I am one of the directors of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and well, we coordinated and co-invited you to this meeting. I think you're all aware of the drastic developments of this pandemic. 2.3 million persons have already been infected. So many people have died in the US, in Brazil, in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Russia, and in so many other countries. And it really drives home the impression that this is a global pandemic, which is why, of course, we need to combat it on a global scale. And the pandemic will only be defeated if it is defeated in every single country. Every country needs to become a safe country. Again, Guterres said that, the UN General Secretary, and he said that vaccination nationalism would be self-destructive. And that is why we need global solidarity. But sadly, I see very little proof of global solidarity developing. And it is also worrying not to see a huge expansion of production sites for the vaccines, for example. There are also medicines that should be coming up. I think that Oxfam was very right in saying that this is a virus that really does not stop at any social border or any national border. And I think we must all be very much aware of the fact that inequalities are on the rise now within countries and also between countries because we do not have enough vaccines. We're far from it. And the Global Health Institute said that 7 billion vaccines had already been ordered and bought. 4.2 billion will be supplied to the rich countries, the industrial countries of the world, and the developing countries will certainly only get deliveries much later. Deliveries of the COVID-19 vaccine, that is, of course. Most of the high-income countries will be able to inoculate the entire population of that given country. A country like Canada, for example, could inoculate 5 times its population from what we can see by the amounts that they ordered in vaccines. And we feel that we will only be able to overcome this crisis if the access barriers are removed. The access barriers consist of an excessive price. And if we could, for example, waive the patent protection and share the knowledge of producing the cure, I think we would be able to move forward much more swiftly and be able to defeat this pandemic much sooner. Obviously, medical supplies need to be organized, but that debate was started a long time ago. We should put the question to others: who decides what's being produced, where it is produced, who holds the patents, who decides on whether the knowledge is shared or not. The pandemic really calls into question the entire global development system and model, basically, because if you talk about licenses and about the fact that the pharmaceutical industry still strives at maximum benefits, then we get nowhere. I think that patents are a very useful IP protection tool, obviously, but in a pandemic situation in which we find ourselves now, we need to be talking at the level of the WTO about certain new regulations or other provisions for protecting the IP. And I think that the barrier of these patents must really be waived if we wish to combat the pandemic. Only if we can do away with the patents will we be able to move forward much more faster, because countries like India and South Africa have already pointed to the difficulties of providing for their own people. South Africa and India, hugely affected by the pandemic, would really like to produce themselves, which is why they appealed to the TRIPS Council to waive some of the provisions of the TRIPS agreement in order to be able to manage the pandemic and to overcome the health crisis. They have asked for a waiver of the patents for COVID-19 products. And they said that this would only, or they asked for it only for as a temporary measure. They don't want this to be an open-ended waiver. They do not request doing away with the intellectual property rights totally. On the 4th of February, a TRIPS Council meeting took place, and all the industrial countries represented there refused to follow the request or to grant the request of India and South Africa. On the 11th and the 12th of March, the TRIPS Council will be meeting again. And at that point in time, the question will arise again whether the waiver be granted or not. I think that this is one of the central tasks that we have to solve if we want to expand global manufacturing of vaccines. COVAX is a new initiative taken at the level of the WHO. It would provide access to vaccines for countries which cannot pay for the vaccines or which cannot pay the high price for those vaccines. 90 countries have joined the initiative. 5 billion have been paid into it. The European Union earmarked 500 million for that project, and I am not at all opposed to this initiative, but let's be very clear about it. COVAX will, for example, be using public funds for development cooperation, for example, from those budgets for development cooperation, in order to overcome a health crisis. And I would like to ask you all, how can it be that publicly funded vaccine developments are still not available, or their products are not available globally and publicly? And why is it necessary to take yet another publicly funded initiative to provide for the poorer countries in the world? I simply cannot believe it. And I have to be very honest with you, I don't even want to hear it any longer. I don't want to hear them talk about global solidarity if one of the main instruments of global solidarity would be to simply waive the patent rights. Of course, we can talk about everything and we can discuss anything. We do have huge challenges also in the countries of the global south. We would have to solve the issue of how to cool down vaccines that need to be stored at a temperature of minus 70 degrees centigrade. Things like that would have to be discussed. A country like Bangladesh would have to present a cooling strategy in order to be able to receive supplies of BioNTech, Pfizer vaccines. No, but perhaps we could find other suitable vaccines for other countries too. Obviously, there's also a debate on the diplomacy of the vaccines, but I don't want to even enter into that one at this stage, because I think we should concentrate on the question of how we can waive patent rights in order to make progress. And I think it should really be a convincing argument that the developments of these vaccines were publicly funded, and therefore the vaccines should be regarded as something like a public good. But we'll certainly come back to that debate later. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. You have set the stage for Tahir Amin. Tahir Amin is the co-founder of the NGO and co-director Initiative for Medicines, Access and Knowledge, I-MAK. You find I-MAK equally on Twitter or with the website, and we will now learn from him his perspective on the pandemia and the access to knowledge and medicine. Please, Tahir, you have the floor. We are really honored to have you with us.
No, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Barbara, for a comprehensive opening, which allows me to get into my part of this webinar. I think it's important just to add more context to what Barbara has rightly said. When we look at the millions of vaccinations that are going on in the global north, and as of a couple of weeks ago, that only 25 doses, or some say 55 doses, were actually issued in one low-income country, that was Guinea. We see as the WHO Director General said, a catastrophic moral failure happening right in front of our eyes. And of course, there are a number of factors that are leading to a supply issue, that vaccines are actually being hoarded by the wealthy countries, despite these mechanisms such as COVAX, which incidentally only sort of are going to supply 20% to many lower income countries by the end of 2021, which is not enough given the mutations that are going on and the desperate need to scale up vaccination as quickly as possible. So where does the role of intellectual property, which comprises patents, trademarks, copyrights, come into all this? Well, I think we've heard the term vaccine nationalism being used, and I think that's exactly it. You know, people are hoarding as many vaccines as possible. But the more I look into this, and the more we look at the historical aspects of the intellectual property system, which is why we have this debate happening at the World Trade Organization, where India and South Africa, supported by 100 low and middle income countries, have asked for a waiver of intellectual property, not just patents, because there are different aspects that go into vaccines. There's a lot of trade secrets and know-how, which, you know, many journalists refer to as the secret recipes that make these vaccines. And, you know, when we look at the history about that, I think we're facing more than just vaccine nationalism. We are facing economic nationalism. And this is what actually created the World Trade Organization. If you look at the history, it was something that was essentially forced upon the global south by the industrial north, as at the behest of companies like Pfizer back in the 70s, which then basically got the government of the US to essentially get this into a multilateral trading system. And so here we are today, where we are facing a once-in-a-century pandemic global health crisis. And the architects of this system refuse to budge in what could be a significant sort of count of bodies that are mounting up because of the lack of vaccine supplies. Now, many will say, and the arguments have come that have been laid out at the World Trade Organization, you know, the arguments are, well, you know, it will stop innovation, it will stop companies investing, we can't just do away with these rules, or that there's not enough production capability, particularly for these new vaccines, which are messenger RNA, you know, the BioNTech and the Moderna vaccine. So, you know, we can't just go get this supply, you know, these manufacturers up and running from anywhere. And also that the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement already has flexibility, so we don't need to mess around with that. And if we break down each of those, what I call deflections, as opposed to arguments, these are all stalling tactics, which we've heard time and time again in other public health crises, such as the HIV/AIDS crisis. Back then, it was said that, oh, well, you know, people in Africa can't take they won't be able to take antiretrovirals. They should just do some other public health measure. Or we've heard, for example, with hepatitis B vaccines, when India was trying to license the technology, and they said, well, your scientists won't be good enough to be able to understand these technological capabilities. And yet they went on to produce a hepatitis B vaccine, which became part of the UNICEF program. So these are all, unfortunately, I have to bring in the term, there's an element of scientific racism going on in terms of saying that the global south is incapable of actually producing some of these vaccines. And when you think about the developing country vaccine manufacturing network, which is comprising 41 companies, which supply 3.5 billion doses of different types of vaccines to global programs like UNICEF. I find it hard to believe that none of these manufacturers can be scaled up or actually supported with funding to actually start making some of these vaccines. And what it comes down to is actually proprietary knowledge. It comes down to a system that is built on maximizing extraction. And when you think of the vaccines like mRNA and that Moderna and BioNTech have, it's not just about what's happening with COVID, because that's going, I mean, COVID's endemic now, essentially, if you listen to some epidemiologists, and there's going to be a market supply of this for God knows how long. So they're going to make a significant amount of money. But what they're also looking at with these platforms is future treatments for cancer and what have you, and they don't want to give that recipe away. It's understandable, but what we're doing is we're holding future pipeline profits for basically they're holding on to that instead of actually trying to solve a global crisis, much of which was publicly funded, as Barbara said. If you think of the Moderna vaccines, it was purely public funded by the Operation Warp Speed. Even the spike proteins that made it possible to use mRNA was publicly funded. And so it's really damning. I think the governments, particularly the governments in the global north, who have the power to put leverage onto these pharmaceutical companies, because if you think about the global production at the moment, it's all in the north, other than a few licenses that we given to Serum Institute and Johnson & Johnson to Aspen in South Africa. There are probably 3 or 4 manufacturers in the global south that have been given some kind of technology capacity. And I think there's no governance on this issue. It's actually being outsourced to the private actors to govern a global crisis. And so there's a lack of leadership. And what really needs to happen is for the governments to either support the waiver or to get their companies to start transferring the technology to as many suppliers as possible and build a capacity, because this is not going to be the only pandemic we face. We have many more likely coming down the road. And if we don't have global production capacity and we continue with an IP system, which is really not designed to deal with these large scale issues, despite the fact that we've had this, Herculean effort to get the vaccines out so quickly. I mean, most of it was public funding. The private actors only entered essentially to take it over the line. And so I think we really need to look at the systems that we have and the governments actually that have the power and influence over these corporations to get them to wield and actually yield and give some of this tech transfer across, because otherwise we are not going to see the end of this issue until at least 2025-26.
Thank you for these clear words. Before I give the floor to Julia, I would like to ask one more question to you as a trade lawyer. What options do countries now have legally in order to get access to this technology, which is obviously key for the livelihood? You were saying quite rightly, it's not only about patents, it's about also trade knowledge and secrets. But what legal possibilities do countries now have?
Well, if we're not talking about vaccines, I mean, there's always compulsory licensing, which are within the flexibilities of the TRIPS agreement, which is the World Trade Organization agreement that governs intellectual property. And while that might be useful for maybe some antivirals that may become developed, or some of these monoclonal antibodies, which they're not as effective as initially thought. Even remdesivir is not as effective as initially thought. There are certain aspects that you can use these waiving of IP by using compulsory licenses. I mean, for Germany, for example, has updated its laws with respect to this, as have other countries like Canada and Israel. But ultimately, when it comes to vaccines, we need much more solidarity. We need a sharing of knowledge. And if we're thinking of the future, one of the things that really this speaks to is actually the IP system is not the most effective system in a pandemic type situation. You need more open science. You need more collaborative effects, because at the end of the day, it slows down the ability to get the optimal results. And I think even the World Health Organization, I should have mentioned this, has tried to create a technology pool where people can actually deposit their technology and data and what have you, so that there's this collective sharing. And to date, as far as I'm aware, not one pharmaceutical company has actually provided any data or technology to that pool. So we're seeing really this hoarding of knowledge, which, you know, it's nothing new. It's happened in various public health crises, and a lot of it was built to do what it was designed to do. It was to give power and advantages, comparative advantages, to a few nations, and that's why TRIPS was created. And so we can talk about vaccine nationalism, but this was designed and created the way it's actually working. But now we have a pandemic, and we're trying to say, okay, well, what should we do?
Thank you. That was very clear. I will now give the floor to Julia Reda, not before reminding you that first, we are getting more and more participants, so nobody seems to bore so far. On the other hand, we want to hear also your views. So please share them with us under Q&A or F&A, either in German or in English, and name who you are if you ask a question or give us your opinion. Try to be short. Some of these remarks are so long that I can impossibly read them. But what's even more important, please also give a like to those remarks and questions you like most, and we will try to tackle those issues first, which have been shared by most and liked by most. But now, Julia Reda, IP specialist of the Society for Civil Rights based in Berlin. Julia, how are you?
Hi, Sven. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I will take advantage of the excellent interpretation. So I will speak in English for now, but I'm also very happy to answer questions in German if you prefer that. So a lot of, I think, very relevant and very clever observations have already been made. So I will try to fill in the gaps a little bit and go into more detail on some of the issues that we've touched upon, but that perhaps haven't been explained in detail. First of all, I think for some people, apparently the humanitarian argument for sharing the knowledge that is necessary to produce the vaccines is not enough. I mean, I think it really should be the possibility to save hundreds of thousands of lives and also to save the quality of life of the many people who have had severe COVID infections that could be prevented through widespread vaccination, I think should be argument enough. But even for those who are not swayed by the humanitarian argument, I think it's important to point out that the patent policy and also the trade secret policy that we are working with in the pandemic is foolish from a healthcare perspective in our own countries, in the global north. It's economically foolish. And it's geopolitically foolish. So there are really no good arguments, I believe, to stick with the systems we have. So perhaps it's obvious to people, but just to elaborate a little bit on this question, why it's not over for any of us until it's over for all of us. Like you could think, oh, well, if it's actually the case that everybody in Germany gets a vaccine by the end of the year, then it's over for us. This is not true. First of all, no vaccine has 100% effectiveness rate. And there may also be some people who cannot get the vaccine because of pre-existing conditions. So there's really a huge importance to achieve this herd immunity so that those who are not protected by the vaccine cannot be infected. And also, as it has been mentioned before, the virus has kept mutating over the course of the last year. And only in the last months, we have really seen how challenging this can be and how it can also make the crisis more severe at a point when some people had hoped that we had already seen the worst of it. And of course, the larger number of people that is infected with the coronavirus at any given point in time, the larger the rate of mutation is going to be. And so even if you have a relatively high vaccination rate in Europe, which we don't have at the moment, At the moment, vaccination is really not where we would like it to be. If the rest of the world doesn't have access to the vaccines, there is a real danger that a mutation could arise that the existing vaccinations are not as effective against. So really, the only way of eradicating the pandemic is to make vaccines accessible globally as quickly as possible to stop this really rapid rate of mutation. On the economic level, I also have to note that even if you believe that it's important to create this economic incentive for the production of patents, which I don't think it is, and as Tahir has already mentioned some arguments for, even if you do believe in that, I think the economic damage that the pandemic has caused in the real economy really stands in no proportion to any perceived gains of the profits of pharmaceutical companies. So I think even if the economy is sort of the thing that is at the top of your minds, I think 1 year into the pandemic, we have learned that the damage to the real economy from having to live with the pandemic for such an extended time is really substantial and is also costing the public hand quite a lot. I think at the international level, it's also important to point out that even though this initiative at the World Trade Organization has come from two countries that have production capacities of their own, India and South Africa, quite a lot of countries do not. And those countries that are unable to produce vaccines domestically are also much less likely to be able to benefit from those so-called flexibilities, such as collective or mandatory collective licensing of vaccines, because the TRIPS agreement, the way that it is designed, makes it very difficult to import generic vaccines from another country if you're not able to develop it domestically. So it's really important, especially for the poorest countries, to pass this waiver at TRIPS level, because, well, if you don't have a domestic production capacity, issuing a compulsory license is not going to solve the problem for you. So I think it's also important to point out that South Africa is already producing a vaccine candidate by Johnson & Johnson, but is actually not producing it for the domestic market. So I think this also underlines the point about unfairness or vaccine racism that Tahir has raised, that where countries in the global south do have production capacity, they're actually producing the vaccine for the global north. So I think this is also an issue that is, well, rightfully going to raise a lot of, well, let's say bad feelings about the way that the global north has been handling this crisis. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned at all is that we have increasing evidence that Russia and China have actually developed vaccines that work. And the companies or institutions behind those vaccines from Russia and China that have not been vetted by the European Medical Association or by the WHO, they are still being produced and are being actually licensed a little bit more freely than the vaccines from the West. So eventually, I think there is going to be access, but it's going to take many years at this rate. And at this rate, it's also very likely that a much larger proportion of the global population might end up getting vaccines from Russia and China. And I think from a geopolitical perspective, we in Europe also have to ask ourselves what message we are sending to the rest of the world, that basically, in order to protect the profits of a few pharmaceutical companies, we are unwilling to show leadership in this situation and unwilling to be the biggest part of the solution, so to speak. And I think this is very short-sighted. We already saw this at the beginning of the pandemic, where some countries, for example, in Eastern Europe, really felt left behind and felt a lack of a solidarity from the European Union as a whole and from other countries, where there was, especially in the beginning, quite a lot of every country for itself mentality. And then it was China that would be sending medical supplies to some countries in Eastern Europe, for example. And I think it's perhaps not such a good idea to repeat this mistake by basically placing the profits of companies over the need to roll out vaccines globally as quickly as possible, and also for Europe and the United States to play an important role in this. And yeah, perhaps finally, I also wanted to touch upon this point about trade secrets, because with trade secrets, I mean, as Sven knows, I worked on trade secrets in the European Parliament quite a lot, and I've actually not seen a case where trade secrets have ever been used in the public interest. I mean, at least with patents, there is this theory that you give a monopoly that is limited in time, and when that monopoly runs out, at least then the invention is a public good. Whereas with trade secrets, you're basically incentivizing companies not to share, which really does not make a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think actually the coronavirus research is the best example of that. We would not have had a vaccine in this really amazing time of just 1 year after the pandemic started if there wasn't a very liberal sharing of knowledge around research data and research results. So a lot of researchers that were doing very basic research about the pandemic from the very start have been publishing research results as open access, also as a means of staying relevant. And so this is sort of, I think, been a very important puzzle piece, aside from the substantial public funding that has been provided to actually develop and roll out the vaccines. So we've actually seen from the speed that research has been able to progress because of open science and open access, that this is something that is in everybody's benefit. And I just don't see the same public interest in protecting trade secrets, because it's basically incentivizing behavior that doesn't benefit anyone but the company that is holding the trade secrets, which raises the question why there should be legislation to protect it. So I think we should really talk about alternatives. I mean, one alternative is simply to say, well, the cost of the development of the vaccines has already been covered, and it has been more than covered. So the companies that have put vaccines on the market have already made a sizable profit. And we should also, in this equation, not forget the orders that have already been placed. So as we know, and as has been mentioned, a lot of countries in the global north have ordered many more doses than they're actually going to need, and they have negotiated a price for that. So this is already money that is earmarked to go to these companies, whether we actually void the patents or not. I mean, those orders have been placed. And the other, I think, very important argument why there is perhaps not as much of a need for an incentive as some companies claim is indeed the very sizable public funding for it. But I also wanted to mention, even though it's perhaps a little bit too late for this vaccine, the fact that there are alternative ideas around delinkage. So Sven, you have mentioned at the beginning that we should not create artificial scarcity. So I find it also very interesting to look at alternatives incentives where, for example, a government could simply issue a prize for the development of a particular medication that is a fixed sum, instead of issuing a patent as sort of the prize for developing a vaccine. So I think these delinkage ideas are also worth going into in terms of what we can learn about what we have done wrong in this pandemic, because it's not going to be the last. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. And I would now like to start reading some of the top-rated questions. And the first one is by Hans Dembowski. He has written in English, why are developing countries and emerging markets not making use of the compulsory licenses the WTO Doha Summit permitted in 2001? Every country is entitled to doing that if it is needed, safeguard public health. The fact that they are not used has eroded this major victory. So, and I will read another question which is related to this. And now, exactly. So by Martin Lippel, I will translate the German question into bad English. And that is there a possibility for a country in order to freeze or to set free a patent without having to ask the producer, or a common decision, a consensus by all countries concerned? And then the question by Corinna Fischer, on which basis runs the current vaccine production of India? So probably she's asking on what legal basis, which intellectual basis. So perhaps I leave it here and would first give these questions to Tahir.
Right. I hope I can remember all those. I was writing them down. On the first one, if I understood it correctly, I do believe that the lack of use of compulsory licenses, even though, as I mentioned in my my little talk, I think it's going to require more than compulsory licenses to get the vaccine supplies to where we need them. However, the person who did raise a question as to has this the use of compulsory license being weakened through the WTO because of Doha and what have you, I think that's right. Every time a country in previous public health issues tried to use these as national emergencies, there has been a significant amount of political pressure put on them. And often that's why we don't see these instruments used. And despite actually what's interesting when you look at the debates that's going on at the WTO, the countries that have been opposing the waiver have been saying, well, you know, you've got flexibilities. Well, all of a sudden they're saying that you can use the very flexibilities that they've denied many of these countries over the years. And so what we're seeing is just the moving of the sort of marker. Now, all of a sudden there's this kind of larger sort of push against the intellectual property system, but now the countries that are holding all the cards are saying, well, actually now you can use flexibilities, and they're just pushing the can down the road. And so I think that probably is a more of a historical discussion as to why countries don't use it, because they get trade sanctions. The US has a report that comes out every year, special 301 provisions, which is sort of threatens trade sanctions against countries that are going to use it. And so this hesitancy, and I think there's a bigger debate that's going on with the WTO TRIPS waiver, I think, is that it's a push against this history to try and sort of really make these provisions work for the global south, not just for this pandemic, but going forward. So there's a better understanding that when there is a national emergency, that these things can be used without these threats. And I think that's really the sort of behind a lot of this as well, and rightly. And the second question was freezing. If was it about freezing patents? Was that right? Well, again, I think freezing patents one thing, but again, I think it comes down to, as Julia said, there's a lot of trade secret aspects to the vaccines as well. It can work for certain treatments or PPE or other, diagnostics or ventilators, but for the vaccines, unfortunately, I think we do need a sharing of knowledge and trade secrets. That we can't deny that. So while the TRIPS waiver is a part of the solution, it's not the entire solution. And there needs to be knowledge sharing, and there needs to be this to use the president of the EU's language at the beginning of all this. This is global common good, and that's whether that's technology or whether that's the actual vaccines. And so simply freezing patents is only one step in a few steps. And in terms of India, I mean, they are governed by the World Trade Organization. Every country has to adhere. They can use their sovereignty and take the risk and suspend all patents or whatever it will. The likelihood is there'll be a political crisis because countries will start leaning on them. But perhaps maybe it requires a country that has at least some political power and standing to just sort of say, well, we're just going to do this anyway, and then see how the world reacts. I think it'd be terrible PR for the global north to try and actually pile themselves and the pharmaceutical companies on a country in the global south trying to protect the lives of its people. So maybe it might be an option if there can't be a TRIPS waiver, just go and do it.
If I understand you correctly, Tahir, and perhaps Julia and Barbara want to come in on this as well, but if I understand you correctly, it is not enough to issue compulsory licensing. Even if the countries will do this, they still need the access to what we call trade secrets. So in particular, production technology and how to produce the vaccines. And therefore, the question is what it is really about, that both of that had to be put into the public domain, and a sharing of this knowledge to more producers. I would put it in a new German green language, to allow more market. So you first have a decision to put something public domain for the common good, and then you could have more market in the sense that you have more potential producers. What do you suggest as compensation for those who developed the technology? So there was one question which I would link to this, because I found it very interesting, and I will read it. Unfortunately, the order is always changing. Here. And I will read it in German because I was reminded that we have translation. Haben Sie Kenntnis darüber?
Do you know anything about how long science and industry have worked at the foundations of RNA technology without public funds? Because medicines, science does not come from nothing. Before you have fundamental research and research that took place in the past made these developments possible. That is true, but without patents, how do you want to have incentives for expensive research? Also, with a look to coming pandemics, the global inequality has deeper roots than IPR, than intellectual property rights.
What do you make of that? And then I'll bring in Julia and Barbara. Jetzt bin ich im falschen Kanal.
It's a good question. I actually wrote a piece for this the American it's a health publication called Stat. It was called how basically COVID has exposed the broken pharmaceutical model. And if you look at how much the private sector invests in pandemic or neglected diseases, if we may say, it's barely it's not even 1% of the top 20. If you take the top 20 pharmaceutical companies and their revenue, which is some 661 billion, they don't even invest even 1% of that in neglected diseases. And, if we look at the pandemic type situations, SARS, MERS, all these things, they haven't invested anything. Most of it comes from government funding and philanthropy. And so this idea that we're not going to get these vaccines, which has been proven already with COVID, if you think about all the billions, some 16 billion at least, that has been invested by public funding. And of course, the private sector has a role to play. Because it's got these capacities to expand supply and production and get these things to market. And I think even if we look at getting away from COVID for a minute, modern pharmaceutical industry today is not about invention. They have become either marketing firms, great supply chains, or they have become essentially equity firms, private equity firms, because they invest in future technologies that others have developed and they just buy them in. So the idea that these big pharmaceutical companies are inventing and doing all the invention is a bit of a myth, actually. And so I think in terms of compensation, this is a global market. This, for the first time, this is a global market. And it's not as though it's not just 8 billion people, nearly 8 billion. You're going to need at least 10, 12 billion doses of these vaccines. So there's enough to go around for at least 7, 8, 9, 10 manufacturers. And you can see this even from the analyst studies who say that even if you get a small fraction of the market, you're going to be pretty well off. So it's incentivized to bring a vaccine to market. And I think sharing the knowledge, you're still going to get compensated. I think this idea that we've got into this system whereby basically, unless you maximize profits, then there's this threat that you're not going to do anything. And that's because of shareholders and the way the investment system works into IP. It's all about maximizing and getting as much as possible. So I push back against the idea that we will not get new inventions and new medicines, particularly for pandemic type situations, if we don't actually bow down to the way the pharmaceutical companies want it.
Okay, I will just continue with those questions.
And Barbara, of course, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah, just to add, I think the public pressure definitely has been a factor in disincentivizing countries from using flexibilities. Perhaps to give a more sort of plastic example, South Africa in the 90s was sued over its application of compulsory licensing for HIV treatment. And it turned out to be quite bad publicity to sue Nelson Mandela, but that didn't stop people from trying anyways. And we are seeing the same sort of pressure being put on governments in the global South nowadays. I mean, just last year we had the US government and the European Commission in unison putting pressure on the South African president to send the copyright bill back to parliament because of economic interests as well. So this is not something that is limited, unfortunately, just to the patent area. But I wanted to stress another reason, I think, why these flexibilities have not been used as much is that in order to be able to produce under a compulsory license, you have to have the production capacity because the TRIPS rules, the way that they are in place, these so-called flexibilities, make it extremely hard to actually import the medicines from another country. So if you are not a country like India or South Africa that actually has domestic production capacity, that is not going to help you very much. Es war eine Frage auf Deutsch über, ob es denn möglich ist.
And then there was a question in German to know whether it is possible to suspend these patents, and I'll answer it as in German because I will refer to the German law. I would say yes, that is possible. This is foreseen in patent law, that a patent can be for the public good suspended, but the patent owners are entitled to remuneration or compensation. As to this compensation, you can certainly take into account the public funds the patent owner has already received in the past. And this possibility has been extended during the infection protection law. According to the German infection protection law, the German health ministry alone can take such a decision, doesn't depend on other countries, and not even on the federal government as such. But this possibility has not been used so far. And the patent protection is, as a matter of fact, an important piece of the puzzle. And then on the question whether we are aware how long RNA research works have lasted. Yes, we are aware of it way back into the 20th century. Also, research work took place at the universities, but a structural problem also became visible, namely that at public universities, researchers depend for their career to use public funds, to bring in public funds for their bring in private funds for their public research. And this is why research of the public often does not have enough money. And that's why, unfortunately, mRNA research was not very profitable. There wasn't enough public money because there wasn't enough private money because it was not clear how long it would take when there would be results. And researchers who believed in this method, they have as a way out, set up companies in order to be able to continue with this research work because of the lack of public funding. This was a possibility that paid, but that was negative for the research landscape because such research works didn't take place at the universities anymore. Yes, I would also like to thank Tahir for his words and for what he said on the myth that pharmaceutical companies have to be compensated for their inventions. I think what he said is really true, especially as to the global south. We have huge gaps in certain diseases. There is no investment at all. If there is any, it is public investment. And this means that we have to see whether there are markets and where there is a demand in the global south, which is very decisive for the research landscape. And that really would advocate for the following. I think that it is necessary fundamentally that public funds used for research should be earmarked automatically when given with the obligation of fair prices, with the obligation of opening up data from the clinical trials so that all this knowledge becomes publicly available. And that's interesting that in the context of the COVID pandemic, Costa Rica, very early along the line, opened up a technology or proposed a technology access pool. And at the WTO, this pool has come into existence now. And the good thing about it is that it has been set up because it was meant to make this step to tear down barriers for access to clinical studies, but it's still voluntary things for the pharmaceutical companies. And what I'm missing here is that the industrial countries, which give a lot of public funds, don't make it a precondition for these companies to participate in this tool and to guarantee that they publish their results afterwards. It cannot be, it's not acceptable that we let these companies off the hook. They have to show solidarity during the pandemic, and they have to participate in this access pool and make their data public. There is also an access to COVID-19 tools accelerator. Everything under the WTO umbrella So there are a lot of initiatives which are meant to help out of this problem, to make possible access to knowledge which is covered by patent law and intellectual property rights. But all these things have not reached a level yet, I would say, which really makes it possible, our guarantees that we get where we have to get, namely a fast availability of vaccines. That's what we need. And that's why the production capacities which exist in India and in other countries have to be extended as fast as possible. That's what it's all about. And that's what Julia also said, what I said at the beginning. If we want to stop this pandemic so that doesn't extend anymore, and that large groups of countries, African countries especially, will have to take up huge debt for buying these vaccines and for combating the pandemic. That's why I think that at the next meeting of the TRIPS Council, we need countries to agree on this. It is a crisis, it is an emergency situation, and therefore we have to give up certain things. As Tahir said, things in this historically long TRIPS agreement, which just leads to exclusion.
Ja, vielen Dank, Barbara.
Many thanks, Barbara. I didn't want to cut your speaking time. Tahir said that he will have to take leave in 20 minutes time, and that is why I would like to give him an opportunity to come in yet again if he wishes so. The ambassador of South Africa is with us in the webinar, and now I do have a problem. Stone Sisase, I beg your pardon, Your Excellency, if I mispronounced your name. And he says,
South Africa supports the suspension of patents to facilitate the production of the most effective vaccine, especially because the variants could overtake the existing vaccines as the virus mutates. We call upon the OECD, which owns the big pharma at this stage. Can the MEP call upon EU to support India and South Africa in our call for a temporary IP suspension? I will draw conclusions in the end, obviously, Ambassador, and thank you for your contribution, and I'm very happy to give you the floor when if you use the hand function. I would, yeah, there's one question often asked, and again in German, I will read it in German. Here is, there are two different questions which go in a similar direction. One is by Christel Freier. Warum werden weder von der EU noch von der
does neither the European Union nor Germany offer research funds in the pandemic with the conditionality of the global good or the public good, so as to avoid that pharmaceutical companies reap the profits? This doesn't have anything to do with intellectual property rights. Cost is being socially socialized while profits are being privatized. And the next question is, if the basic research was done in universities and then some startups carried them further and actually started production, can they not sort of pay for part of the research?
So we are specialists in doing this. So, but it was perfect grammar, this question. So, Tahir, I would like to add a question. Do you see best practice which goes into the direction of the two questions? So, are there countries which have developed that further, which ensure that public investment leads also to long-term common good responsibilities of what has been financed? Tahir.
Yeah, it's a great question. And when you think about, for example, let's take the US, where there's a significant amount of public funding that goes from the National Institutes of Health, some 40 billion a year. Unfortunately, the NIH does not make any conditionalities on when that basic research then goes into the private sector. And we have seen that again with COVID. And there's been some great work by the likes of Knowledge Ecology International, Jamie Love there and his colleagues and others, trying to bring more transparency to these kinds of contractual arrangements. One of the big issues, even with COVID, whether it be COVAX or whether it be how Operation Warp Speed was done, who actually, how are these actual arrangements made between the government funding this research and then what the private actor has to actually agree to? And typically what we live in is, again, it goes back to that root of, oh, we are not going to get new medicines or new vaccines unless we adhere to what the private sector demands. Sure, the private sector has a role to play, but when it's coming from a public funding base, there has to be some, to use the term best practice, where there's some conditions built into any transfer or any agreement that if you're licensing this basic research from us, you have to make sure that you are going to supply it at a certain cost, or you're going to actually license it out to others if there's a need, and so on and so forth. Obviously, each situation is different, but none of this is happening, whether it be at the European level, as far as I'm aware, or at the US level. And when we think about the power centers of research in terms of modern medical discovery, they do lie in the global north still. And so in that sense, there is really just a giveaway, and the term, socializing the risk and privatizing the rewards is definitely apt. But that's, I think, related to the modern IP system. It's all built that way, that we hand over all this knowledge and all this technology because we feel that that only the private sector can then deliver. But really, it's actually a combined effect, and even public-private partnerships are lacking in the arrangements in terms of how these agreements are crafted. So it's the best practice is that we do build these things into these agreements where basic research that is funded by governments is then when it's handed to private sector, that there has to be these conditionalities, but it's never done because there's always the threat. And it really makes me wonder, if we live in a system whereby a certain powerful few can threaten governments to say we won't do something, then isn't that a bad system that we are held ransom? I mean, yet we still buy into it. It's almost like we're hostage. And so this is a fundamental problem that we have.
Julia, do you want to come in on this one?
Just perhaps to add on the why part. So why the public sector is not insisting on more conditions. I think that lobbying also plays a big role in this, not just in terms of like the US system, where you have the issue of campaign contributions. And of course, nobody wants to really be seen as hostile to these very large companies. Also in the IP system more generally, we have a pretty significant revolving door issue where people coming from the so-called IP intensive industries quite often take up regulatory positions in the government regarding the oversight and development of intellectual property policy. And I can certainly say from my own experience working on the copyright directive that very little of the public policy in the IP field is driven by academic research and coming up with, proposals to try to solve societal problems. And quite a lot of it is driven by lobbying. And in the context of patents, we've seen this for example, in issues such as the length of patent protection and things like that, that are very rarely based on sort of economic considerations of what would be the Pareto optimal length of protection, but much more on private interest influencing public decision making.
Barbara, do you want to come in, or shall I read some more questions?
Nein, lieber weitere Fragen. Wir sind jetzt wirklich.
Carry on and read some more questions.
Ich werde eine Frage stellen, die
I think
question which, without reading it, but it came here several times. So first, there was the question: is in the real world the patent issue and the issue of a need for compulsory licensing really tackling the limitation in production of COVID-19 related vaccines? So is this really the problem? Is there free capacity which could be developed if they had a more easy access to the knowledge base? So is this really the limiting factor? This question is being asked. And there's also a journalist from a respective German weekly, Die Zeit, asking, does anyone know, Andrea Böhm, does anyone know whether there is any free capacity at the moment in vaccine production, which could be built up in short time? Tahir, Julia, Barbara.
So I keep hearing, one of the common sort of barriers is that there is, if we take the mRNA vaccines, because they're the newer platforms that have never been commercialized before. What's interesting is Moderna and even BioNTech and Pfizer, none of them had ever mass produced these vaccines before, yet they've scaled up manufacturing capacity and being able to do it. And Moderna has outsourced that a lot of that production to a sort of production company called Lonza. So what we're seeing is like if that could be done in such a short space of time, why can't we do that elsewhere? Even if it will take 6 to 12 months, which is a potential realistic thing, that's still going to keep us ahead of the sort of the timelines that we're looking at if we don't do that. So I think it's quite common sense that there is capability. I mean, there's an Indian company called Genova that's actually doing its own phase 1/2 mRNA vaccine. Why aren't we looking for these kinds of companies to say, well, how can you help in terms of potentially producing? Because if you're doing your own, why maybe you can do some more of this. So I do think that there's a lot of information asymmetry going around, that actually, there's no capacity, and particularly the more traditional vaccines, the adenovirus vaccines like the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson and what have you. Well, they've already given it to Aspen and Serum. There are a number of other manufacturers in the global south that could do those types of vaccines. Of course, there'll be raw materials and building up capacity, but again, it's about investing in the right places. No one says this is going to be easy, but no one's actually willing to make the political decision to build up that capacity.
I think you can also ask the question the other way around. If there is no danger that somebody else is going to go and produce the vaccine, then why are the companies keeping the information secret?
So if I would add to this, and also using Tahir's presence, the maximum, I would like to share with you some other questions. So on the one hand, there's the question asked, what roles are played by Russia and China when it comes to production of vaccines? Couldn't China help to scale up the production? They have already vaccinated 40 million people, number 2 after the US. There's also a reference to Cuba, which is about to develop 4 different vaccines at the moment and has already helped in medical areas in other countries. So could this be a model? And lastly, there's a critical remark here, which I would like to read by Raffaella Tiefenbach. I understand the argument here, but the Serum Institute of India will produce 1 billion AstraZeneca vaccines by way of voluntary licensing. AstraZeneca is selling its vaccine on a non-profit basis. Johnson & Johnson will also license in South Africa, India, Russia, and China. So the logical question she's not asking, what's the whole point of this debate? So that was my words. Tahir.
Right. So the question on Russia and China, from my understanding, and again, a lot of this information may not be transparent, but from what I understand and what I've read, the Sinovac vaccine has been licensed to another manufacturer. I don't know if it's fully licensed, but it has been manufactured, as has the Gamaleya vaccine, which has also been licensed to, I think, a manufacturer in Korea. So there are at least those two. I think the Chinese and the Russians need to also embark on, if the efficacy of these vaccines is proven to what it seems to be, they need to also be looking for other suppliers too. I don't think this is entirely on the global north and the Western countries. I think this is a larger issue that everybody who has capacity should be actually trying to increase. And I think we know China's an interesting case because if we kind of go into the political sphere, they haven't really supported the TRIPS waiver as far as I know. That's also because they have climbed that development and technology ladder themselves, and now they are interested in IP themselves. So we've created this system whereby anybody who gets to the top of the ladder, to use the a great economist, Friedrich List from Germany, who said in the 1700s, is that when you climb the ladder, you kick it away so nobody can climb up. And this is the situation we have with TRIPS. It's essentially it's being sort of touted as a economic development tool, but it's actually not in many cases. And so we're faced with this situation where those who have the capacity now have to share it, particularly in a pandemic. And I think, judging by some of the stuff that's going on Twitter, people think that we're trying to bring in the nationalization of pharmaceutical industries. I think what we're dealing with is a particular crisis here. And even the US has a Defense Production Act, which it's actually looking at and has already used for PPE and other things. I think in times like this, we do need to have public production and public capabilities, and or sharing of knowledge is what we're talking about. So I think everybody has a role, whether it's China, the US, Europe, everybody has a role to scale up production. So I'm not just targeting one particular sort of geolocation. And when we talk about the Serum Institute and that budget, well, first of all, it's a voluntary license, and we understand, again, non-transparent, that they can only supply certain countries. And also there's certain non-transparent, some of the prices are different in different countries. I was reading just last week that some countries in Africa are paying way more than what the Europeans are paying for. So, there's a lot more that's going on behind it. And we've known, and I've critiqued the voluntary license system for HIV drugs because what it does is it gives you a certain allotment of countries, and you can only supply those countries. And we're in a situation where we can't have borders on supply. We need actually an open market, because that's the only way we are going to reach everyone and maximize the capabilities to try to stem this pandemic.
Barbara, you wanted to come in?
Ja, ich würde da gerne noch ein bisschen.
Yes, I would actually like to come in on that one because we do have to enlarge the capacities of production for everything that's already been developed and can be produced. So it is important that those production capacities should be created in order to, well, and it's necessary for that, of course, to suspend patents most probably. But we also need to continue with the research and development because we do have areas in the world where we cannot use and and apply those vaccines that need to be cooled down to minus 70 degrees centigrade all the time. So we need to continue pooling knowledge and development and further research in this entire area to overcome the pandemic. How will Bangladesh ever be able to use a vaccine that needs to be cooled throughout the entire process from the delivery to the disposal? And there's also some kind of competition going on for the vaccines. COVAX is some initiative that is underway in order to create some sort of equality of supplies, but many come to the negotiating table to negotiate their own bilateral deals, and there are huge differences in the prices that we can observe in these deals. And the Serum Institute of India, for example, has sold the vaccine to South Africa for $5.50, and that is 2.5 times more expensive than what AstraZeneca charges the European countries. I don't think that we can observe at this stage a huge solidarity in the global south, between global south countries either. And I think we should be very clear about that. It's very important to look very closely at the developments, and Tahir pointed out that, of course, we need supplies everywhere. And Julia said that South Africa is not only producing for its own market, and that some of the pricing policies are very, very unfair indeed. But of course, I don't want to divert our debate from the fact that there must be a temporary suspension of the patents held by the pharmaceutical companies.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. Look, Tahir told us he has to leave now. I don't want to be impolite, so that's why I would like to say bye and thank warmly for your contribution. But you can stay as long as you want with us, so you all the time have asylum in the EU. Yeah, so that is so. And I wish it's. I know it's not so easy in the UK politically at the moment. It's not easy here either. Yeah, so thank you. And we will spread information about your organization to all who registered so that they can learn more about you. And yeah, and I wish you well for your good work.
I appreciate it. Thank you, and good luck with everything, and be safe.
Julia, do you want to come in, or shall we give the floor now directly to a few people who have been waiting to speak? What do you think?
I'm happy to hear more questions. I mean, I think there is a little bit more that can be said about China and Russia, and also perhaps just one point that I think it's good that there is at least some voluntary licensing of the AstraZeneca vaccine, but it's important also to know that we need a diversity of vaccines. Some of the vaccines are perhaps not as efficient against a particular mutation, for example. So it's really important to have not put all your to only emphasize one particular vaccine.
Good, thank you. And perhaps if you can say more on Russia and China, there were several questions in this regard. Please do so, and then I would give the floor to directly and open the microphone.
Sure. Perhaps just to say that there's also, of course, the question of public trust. It's very important to build trust in the vaccine. So everybody who has access to the vaccine also actually decides to take the vaccine. And I think Russia certainly has made some mistakes in that regard by starting the rollout of the vaccine before all the test results were in. But now with a little bit of distance, it does look like the Chinese and Russian vaccines are also working. And they seem to be a little bit more liberal with issuing voluntary licenses than some of the Western manufacturers have. And so I think there is also a question of whether Europe and the US want to show leadership in this regard and make sure that more of the vaccines that can be produced actually are produced.
Thank you. And I will now try to open a bit the microphones of those who have been waiting for a long time. So I start with Patrick Buchmüller. Mal sehen. Sie müssten Ihr Jawohl, bitteschön.
And you should definitely open your mic.
Meine schriftliche Frage.
Hello, I'm a little bit surprised that I have to repeat my written question.
I had a written question
I only had a
in the
question
questions and
in the
answers.
questions and answers. And
what we heard from you,
Mrs.
Unmüßig,
well,
you referred to the
TRIPS negotiations and the waiver.
Negotiations and the waiver. And
the basic question
this
here
refers
would
to
this
the
be
basic
expropriation
question
of patents of pharmaceutical companies,
whether an international
which would be authorized by international
would
agreement. I heard that in the national law, expropriation against compensation is something that is foreseen. Is that the same in international law? i.e. that you could have that waiver?
We introduce or a waiver for IP rights
that you waive
of individual pharmaceutical companies,
medicines, but that you would pay
and
a compensation.
Offer some compensation.
And if yes, if there is this possibility, how could such a
in that situation
regulation look like? I'm not sure I understood the question, but I think
I'm not sure whether I clearly
this is rather a question for the patents expert Julia, because
what
I haven't
you
really
asked.
understood
Julia should answer that.
Yes,
yes, of course
this
it's
is
possible.
possible.
You can suspend
Absolutely.
a patent and offer a compensation. And I think that this is an avenue which would be very useful, because the compensation would not be linked to quantities. It would be an alternative model, really. You would offer a global price, for example, for development of a medical product, and the compensation will not depend on the quantity delivered. So you wouldn't have to pay more for 1 million or for 2 million doses, but or shots, other than the production price, of course. And I think there's nothing legally against such a compensation.
So, Eva Grabosch, mal sehen, ob das jetzt genauso schön funktioniert. Na, sowas. Eva Grabosch, Ihr Mikrofon.
Eva Grabosch, you would have to switch. You would have to switch on your mic.
Sobald Sie Ihr Mikrofon öffnen können, müssten Sie sprechen können.
As soon as your mic is open, you should be able to speak. As long as that doesn't work, I'll open the mic for Frau Brückner, Miriam Brückner. Brückner?
Ta. So, das kennen wir schon. Silvia
Well,
Urban.
that's something we know from the past. Silvia Urban now.
Ah ja,
Hallo?
bitte schön.
Ja, ich wusste gar nicht, dass ich mich zu Wort gemeldet habe, aber da ich nun schon dran bin, möchte ich gerne doch eine Überlegung anregen, und zwar die Frage der Aufhebung von Patenten und so weiter und diese ganzen öffentlichen Politiken in den westlichen Ländern zur Unterstützung der Pharmaindustrie sind natürlich auch an die Problematik des Outsourcings und der Standortpolitik gebunden. Die Regierung kokettieren und bewerben sich gegenseitig natürlich darum, dass die mächtigsten und potentesten Industrien in ihrem Land bleiben und woanders hingehen, wo sie andere und vielleicht bessere Bedingungen bekommen. Und das ist also der große, sag mal, ich stehe voll hinter eurer Politik, aber ich sehe da ein großes Handicap und frage mich, ob man nicht gleichzeitig oder noch viel stärker auf anderen Ebenen eingreifen sollte, also wie zum Beispiel durch Ethikkodexen innerhalb der Industrie. Es gibt ja schon ein Code of Conduct, der also bestimmte Kriterien innerhalb der Industrie in Hinsicht auf Gemeinwohl, Umweltschutz und so weiter und lautere Geschäftemacherei vorwärts trägt. Und ebenso wichtig, finde ich, ist die Einbindung der Berufsorganisationen von den Gewerkschaften über wissenschaftliche Organisationen und so weiter. Denn natürlich ist all das nur machbar, was geschieht, solange es hingenommen wird von den Menschen, die direkt in diesen Institutionen und die in der Forschung arbeiten.
And institutions who are in research. Yes, that is true. Thank you very much. I'd like to read another question we have received in written. We haven't dealt with it yet, but I don't know where Barbara now is. Oh yeah, I see her now, because it's a question relevant in this respect for Barbara and also for Julia. Hans de Bofke raised a question in English, so I'm going to read it out in English.
Country does not feel strong enough to take on a multinational patent holder, the African Union or a regional organization like ECOWAS could organize joint action. Why are African governments not rising to that responsibility? WTO rights are useless if those who have them do not apply them. Vielleicht willst du einsteigen diesmal, Barbara, und dann geben wir.
You want to make the start now, Barbara, and then Julia. Barbara, please. Yes, as far as I know, and as far as I can comment on this, in the WTO, there is the principle of unanimity. This means that country groups or regional organizations, ECOWAS or the African Union, none of them have special rights. So in the WTO, the thing is that unanimity is the rule, and the decision on whether a waiver is applied or not needs unanimity. And that's why we really have to think about a WTO reform, about all these legal questions. And we have to think about these questions as to the WTO in general, have to wonder which trade agreement, in how far trade agreements need climate standards, environmental standards bindingly. And I think that the African Union cannot achieve anything in this sense. What is happening at the moment is that there are new foundations, new setting ups of things in the WTO, like this technology access pool and the other things I have mentioned. And I think in this respect, there is a possibility to deal with barrier questions or access questions. But while also speaking about the fact that that should not be voluntary, because public funds have been used, and these public funds should then be earmarked to such companies making their knowledge available. This would be the way forward, I think, which we need also in the new WTO facilities like the access poll. Such questions have to be discussed there, and waivers have to be a possibility in this system. Individual groups of countries, I think, cannot reach anything as long as there is unanimity. Well, I would also like to answer what Miriam Brickner asked. I think she is absolutely right, and that's why we are holding such meetings as today's meeting. I think the public is very powerful, and the behavior of the European Commission or the European member states in this international fora has to be supervised by the public. I think there is still not enough democratic control of the EU Commission by the European Parliament as to these negotiation rounds. That would definitely be a call which I would formulate on this basis. And I think that Corona is now the occasion for more activity in this sense. More MEPs, I think, should look into this international fund, and more researchers and more critical shareholders maybe can contribute to things changing in the future. But I think we definitely shouldn't leave it all to the market. We should point out, or we should seek also the legislator to become active and take up responsibility, as well as the governments.
Huch. Ich höre hier gar nichts mehr.
At the moment, I'm not hearing anything, but we can hear you, Sven. Well, that's something, but well, instead of talking nonsense, I'd rather give the word to Gerhard Trapp. Let's see what you have to say, Mr. Trapp. You have the floor. Provided you switch on your mic, that is, which doesn't seem to be the case. Now I can see your mic open. Mr. Trapp, can you speak? Your mic is on, but we cannot hear you. So I leave your mic open. If you can solve the problem on your side, that would be great. In the meantime, I give the floor to Manfred Keil. Mr. Keil, you also would have to switch on your mic.
Das Glück ist uns nicht so recht hold.
Somehow it's not our day today.
Okay.
Well, be it as it may, as long as it doesn't work, I try to bring families together, because there is another former colleague I have noticed, namely Eva Lichtenberger. And this is something which I also do for Julia. You have the floor. Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Hello, Julia. I think it's great that after I've left, somebody else is there to deal with patent questions, which was a very important topic for me. Eva, what is the tweeting in the background? Well, that's a parrot. That's a parrot I have in foster care. So my question is, What about the majorities in the European Parliament currently? Back then, years ago, when we negotiated the patent question, the scenery was the following. The conservative groups really clung to patent rights. The Social Democrats and the Liberals were of a divided opinion. What's the situation at the moment? That would be my first question. My second question is, with building up production capacities, am I right in assuming that things cannot work as long as we cannot throw the trade secrets overboard? Am I right in assuming this? Thank you. Yes, well, dear Eva, I would never have dared to say that you have a bird, which in German means that you are crazy. But now, under these circumstances, I can say it thanks to your parrot. So I try to give the floor to 2 or 3 more persons, and then we have to wrap it all up. I see here Bernd Schade. Yes, hello, good evening. Can you hear me? Yes, wonderful. There is one thing. In the pharmaceuticals industry, there is a whole host of problems which are so huge that we all have to do something. This pharmaceutical system financed by the private industry, this is something paradoxical, isn't it? I think about bacteria research and antibiotics research, because on the one hand, you produce more antibiotics, but if you are a private company, you have to sell as much as possible, which means that new antibiotics are pretty soon obsolete. And I'd like to raise the following question. Shouldn't we think about the following in this private form? Something like the pharmaceutical industry cannot really be kept up currently when there are so many things that the companies are compelled to do, which are not oriented towards the shareholders. I mean, is this a business model? Should we find a different form in order to be better prepared in the future? Thank you.
Ebenso, vielen Dank für die Frage.
Thank you very much for the question. And I think there is time for one further question, after which I would slowly but surely try to reach the end. I see Gerda Kössler, Ms. Kössler. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. I think the contribution of the previous speaker is very positive. I was a little bit shocked to hear that the vaccine production has been slowed down because of patents. So people seem to die because there are not enough vaccines around, or don't they play any important role anymore? Now we're discussing about doctors and so on. I can follow the whole situation now, I have to say, quite honestly. So I'm not a Querdenker or a conspirationalist, but all these things make me think a lot, including of a program in public television I listened to yesterday, namely that shareholders got dividends and that the people who work in the German parliament or in the public administrations, they don't receive more money, even though they had to work more than in the past. But people who have an assured income, well, they should not become more money, I think, and additional pay. The people who have their assured income, they should not receive such benefits, I would say. In times when many people cannot be sure to have any income at all. So that is catastrophic, I think. And recognizing this, I think, is something very frustrating, I have to admit. Thank you very much. For this question, I'm going to take it up, but I would say we'll start now with the final round. Who would like to start? Julia, maybe, because Barbara and I will then finish it all as co-organizers.
Gerne. Also zunächst mal interessiert mich auch brennend die Antwort auf Evas Frage, wieso die Mehrheiten im Europaparlament sind und ob es Hoffnung gibt für eine progressive...
Yes, with pleasure. Also whether there is hope for a progressive policy of the European Parliament as goods policies. I'd like to answer the question of Eva, whether trade secret is an important part of the puzzle. I think the EU in the last mandate adopted a directive in this sense. We in our group were against whistleblower protection was the center of the debate, which I think is still a major problem when it comes to trade secrets. But I think the discussion now on vaccines shows that as to trade secrets, there are much more problems than that, because there is this exclusivity or something similar as an exclusive right without without a counterpart, because otherwise what you want to patent has someday to become public when the patent runs out. But as to trade secrets, you don't have that. So the public does not get any benefit from trade secrets. Therefore, we should wonder whether additionally to the trade secret, we need certain rules on it with exceptions. And I think there are major injustices in corona policies. Some of them may not be avoidable, others are. But in the end, the answer to all this is that we should seek to end the pandemic as soon as possible, because I think that there are many politicians which really try to adopt measures as fair as possible, but don't think of all possible life situations that can be concerned and might make mistakes. But we should try to end the pandemic as soon as possible, because it's a huge burden on all of us, also on huge parts of the society.
Ja, ich kann da ganz gut anschließen.
I think I can come in at this stage. What we know today, how the inequalities are exaggerated by the actual developments of the pandemic, is very visible. And Julia's right. A lot of people try to take up the challenge with a maximum of fairness. But inequalities, unfortunately, grow in an exponential way. And even with the recovery package, it will not be greatly improved, I'm afraid. Inequalities between the genders are aggravated, and that is why I am so interested in finding a global solution. And we're not only talking about vaccines to defeat the pandemic, we also need medical therapy in the broader sense. So if you take the challenge as a very serious one, you must also acknowledge that it's a global challenge and we need a global solution, which is why we should be reflecting on practical measures of global solidarity. And the acid test to me seems to be the WTO and the TRIPS Council, which needs to agree to the requests of South Africa and India. That should be a very first step. I also think that the COVAX initiative and the technology access pool are great ideas, but I'm afraid that they will only be able to help if some states co-fund these initiatives, and it would be easier and more straightforward perhaps to suspend the patents. And obviously, health should be regarded as a public good, which is why perhaps we need to reflect on the provision of health in the future and to look at it, providing it more publicly and not leave the choices only to private enterprises and to the pharmaceutical companies. So thank you very much for all your ideas and your comments and your questions. A lot still to do. Thank you very much, Julia, for your very good and strong input. I miss you, really. I'm not sure what you wanted way back, but I really regret that you did not find your way in the direction of the Greens, but we do need very, very strong NGOs, and that is why I wish you every luck on earth with your Society for Civil Rights. And obviously the Heinrich Böll Stiftung and Foundation will remain a very important partner to us. But let me come to the present situation at the European Parliament. In the European Parliament, it wasn't even necessary to think of any bonuses and to discuss bonuses because Europe will certainly not fail because of too low pays. Some of the bonuses and extra amounts paid in that context seem to be irrational to me too, but some of the public servants and employees of public enterprises have received bonuses because others have received those bonuses. So it's basically the rule of equality of treatment for all the public servants and the public employees. I don't think it is a huge scandal at that. But there are many inequalities and many injustices that we should understand as real challenges. And I have to say that it worries me. It's a great concern. My wife is a medical doctor doctor, and she has to deal and has to treat COVID-19 patients. And so many people have fought very hard for good health and for good and better living conditions. Many people have an income that really is clearly below a dignified income, and those people living on very low income simply cannot make ends meet nowadays, and that is very, very unjust. And we need to address it, because if someone with a high income will have no problem with small bonus payments, well, that's one thing. But someone who lives on a very low, below the poverty threshold almost income, that person will not be able to make ends meet with a too small bonus payment. We were asked during the webinar whether we could start an initiative or an activity at the level of the European Parliament for global solidarity. And global solidarity is very important indeed. There was no support, however, for the access to all those ideas and to the intellectual property. And I quite liked the argument that was made today. If it's so important to produce the vaccines, then it should definitely be made available publicly. And you can think of concessions and licenses and all the rest of it, and you could really share the knowledge and technology of producing those vaccines. And I'm sure that the companies will be hugely compensated for such a move, because the market is there. You don't have to fear anything. You don't have to fear a loss of income. So in this context, I'm afraid that nobody wishes to establish an example or lead by way of examples. Everyone who's developed and produced the vaccine knows that they will make huge profits, and they deserve it. Of course, they deserve it. But if we don't take the step of making the knowledge accessible, then I think they fear that if they went down that road, in other areas, knowledge and technology would also have to be shared. But I think in the eyes of such a pandemic, we have to take such bold measures and initiatives. And I think that there are many startups and many growing companies who have bright ideas and do wonderful basic research. And if they develop something great and something that will fly in the future, and then they are bought up by big pharmaceutical companies, then it should be compensated, obviously. And I think it's interesting to consider such concepts of offering very high prices for the solution to a societal problem. Those who solve the problem will be compensated richly, but after that, the knowledge and the technology will be of the public domain. And I think as the Greens, we should really not be picky about it. But I think that the solution of a public good must really be shared with everyone else. And I think anything, any decisions and initiatives taken by private enterprises and the government and the public authorities should be linked. Julia, I have to tell you that the majorities have not changed in the European Parliament. We do have progressive majorities for the environment, for equality between men and women. We took the decision on ending the consumer habits as we know them now. And the Christian Democrats are voted down in so many of their initiatives that are too conservative. But in all those areas where the economic and trade interests come to the fore, which is always the case when intellectual property is present, then we do have a strong conservative majority. We do have a pro-European mandate, a very strong ecological or environmental mandate, but we don't have a clear majority to move forward in the area of the economy. We have achieved quite a lot of victories. The end of state aid to fossil fuels, the Green Deal itself is a huge victory. It's not a Green New Deal, it's a Green Deal. And that has a lot to do with the results achieved in the elections. And we will have to continue changing the majorities in our own country and carry on working. But we are cooperating with the foundation here today. So this is why I want to leave it at that. We do have many actors in this area, and the Böll Foundation will also offer further material and input. I think that it was highly interesting for us, and a lot of food for thought is to be taken away from this webinar. I think we will be able to achieve the green change. Thank you very much. All the best to you, Sven, and goodbye, Julia and Barbara and Sven.